This video is brought to you by MUBI, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from all around the globe. Get an entire month free at mubi.com/finalgirlstudios. In a world where Hollywood stars are seemingly melting away before our eyes from Ozempic injections gone rampant, children as young as 7 are developing anti-aging skincare routines, and men like Brian Johnson are performing blood plasma transfusions with his son in a desperate pursuit of youth, Coralie Farjah's sophomore film The Substance feels as though it couldn't have come at a more apt time within the current cultural climate. The Substance has been the film on the tip of everyone's tongue and heralded as one of the biggest must-see films of the year so far. Coralie Farjah takes us on an exploration of the female psyche expressed through the experience of aging Hollywood star Elizabeth Sparkle as the hyperbolized expression of what I am referring to as the simulacrum of feminine performance. Part 1. Defining the simulacrum of feminine performance. Throughout the film, there is a repeated verbal reference to the idea of the Matrix. When Elizabeth is first given the USB stick with the advertisement for The Substance, on it the ad says the following: "You are the Matrix. Everything comes from you, and everything is you." This line is recited as there is a ball of Play-Doh on the table. The ball of Play-Doh is torn into two pieces. Whilst one side is left imperfect and crinkled, the other is rolled into a perfect sphere. Whilst the idea of the Matrix is being said in an obvious allusion to provoke the imagery of the 2001 film The Matrix, it is likewise important to make note of the book that largely inspired the ideas expressed within The Matrix, Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. Simulacra and Simulation is a 1981 philosophical text written by French philosopher and sociologist Jean Baudrillard. During pre-production of The Matrix, the majority of the cast and crew were under strict instruction to read Simulacra and Simulation. Additionally, Keanu Reeves was instructed to read Simulacra and Simulation before he was even allowed to open the script, to ensure he understands the script to its fullest potential. The word simulacra is defined as a replication or imitation of a person or thing. The word was first recorded to be used in the English language in the 16th century to describe and discuss artistic depictions such as statues or paintings, especially in reference to depictions of God. Baudrillard argues that simulacra is not a copy of the real, but rather becomes real in its own right, or what he calls the hyperreal. Hyperreality refers to when one confuses certain symbols or social conventions that have been invented as a result of our subjective or consensus reality and confuse this for an objective reality or truth. In Baudrillard's philosophy, a simulacra is a copy without an original. Referencing the short story On Exactitude in Science, a metaphor used to describe the simulacra is a map metaphor highlighted by Baudrillard within the book. Let's say you have a territory of land. Afterwards, you create a 1-to-1 scale map and place it exactly over the territory, covering the land entirely in this map. Decades pass, and the map remains atop the land, eventually growing more worn out. As time passes, it becomes difficult to discern what is the map and what is the original land poking through. Those who were alive before the map was placed on the land are long since dead, and therefore no one can remember a time without the map. Eventually, the map becomes the land, at least in the perception of those who know it to be that way. Due to their perception, this is their reality and their truth. The map becomes real and the original territory and land is forgotten. This is a simulacrum, a copy without an original. We see this in discussions of nature versus nurture. What qualities are inherent to femininity versus learned behaviors that we have come to culturally associate and therefore teach to young girls, making them common characteristics prevalent within women and girls. Thus triggering the argument of, for example, are women naturally more nurturing than men, or do we just exist within a culture that instills this belief in girls from the moment they are born? We likewise see the simulacrum of femininity prevalent especially within external beauty standards. Where it has become to be seen as feminine is for women to exist in an altered state. For example, for women to exist in their natural state of being unshaven and barefaced, free of makeup, would be seen as unfeminine or even masculine, despite this being the natural unaltered state of women. We can use that meme that contrasts the depictions of male versus female animals in animated films to further highlight the simulacrum of feminine performance. When an animal is male, they are most often depicted as more anatomically correct than that of the female animal. They are a faithful rendition of the animal because to exist in one's natural state unchanged has come to be associated with the masculine in the simulacrum of gender performance. This can be contrasted by the depiction of their female counterparts in film. Despite the fact that the animal depicted in the film often lacks such obvious sexual dimorphism, in the real world, the animated female animal is warped to fit the simulacrum of feminine performance that we have come to associate with women. And this is done not by enhancing any natural sexual dimorphism that may be present within these animals in the wild, but by echoing the feminine simulacrum of humans that have come to be wrongfully associated with naturally occurring sexual dimorphism. The animated female animal's frame is warped into a curvaceous hourglass. Her natural coloring has been opted to a girlish shade of pink. Her eyes framed by a pair of Ardell wispies. Her lips pouted and glossy. Her hair, or fur, or fins, frames her face in a bombshell blowout, whilst the male animal just, well, exists. Referring back to Baudrillard's map metaphor, women have come to be associated with the map on top of and merged with the land, thus existing within the pressure of simulacra. In the introduction of the influential text, Visual and Other Pleasures, feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey writes, "The sexualized image of women says little or nothing about women's reality, but is symptomatic of male fantasy and anxiety that are projected onto the female image. In this sense, the image of woman that had circulated as signifier of sexuality could be detached from reality, from referring to actual women and become attached to a new referent, the male unconscious. The direction of the gaze shifted satisfyingly from woman as spectacle to the psyche that had need of such a spectacle." What Laura Mulvey speaks on here is the simulacrum of feminine performance, the dissonance between reality and perception, and the lost distinction between the two. The demise of Elizabeth Sparkle is expressed as the hyperbolized neurosis of attempting to keep up with the simulacrum of femininity when you are a living, breathing being. Simulacra don't just happen, but often happens over a long period of time, deteriorating reality. According to Baudrillard, there are 4 stages of simulacra. We can analyze the demise of Elizabeth Sparkle through the 4 stages of simulacra as Baudrillard highlights. Stage 1. Initially, the sign, image, or representation is a reflection of basic reality. There is arguably no example of this stage within the film. Elizabeth Sparkle is already representative of the secondary stage of the simulacra, as I will discuss in a moment. The first stage of the simulacra of femininity in the context of Elizabeth Sparkle would be an ordinary 50-year-old woman who is uninfluenced or unchanged by the expectations of feminine performance as we have come to know them. She exists in her natural state, unaltered. She does not exist with the pressure to upkeep the simulacrum of feminine performance and therefore has not altered her body, even subconsciously, in order to do so. Her purpose is that of a human, not as a woman as we have come to understand in the context of the current culture. Stage 2. The sign makes a basic reality. The image becomes a distortion of reality. Elizabeth Sparkle, as mentioned, is already representative of Stage 2 of the simulacrum when we meet her. In Stage 2, we see the pressure of feminine performance set in. Elizabeth Sparkle is still a woman, but she exists influenced by social conventions of feminine performance. She is not a reflection of a reality, but rather a slight distortion of reality. She is not representative of the average aging woman because she and Demi Moore, who portrays her, have had access to countless cosmetic procedures and enhancements. Because Elizabeth exists within the context of the simulacrum of feminine performance, she is not the average 50-year-old woman, but rather the distorted representation of a 50-year-old woman who has had plastic surgery on her face and likely her body, who has, due to her wealth, had access to non-invasive cosmetic procedures such as facials, personal trainers, stylists, makeup artists, etc. When we look at her naked body in the mirror, she is not the naked body of the everyday 50-year-old. Her breasts are still perky and her stomach is flat. Her lips have been plumped with filler and fine lines likely decreased with Botox. It is written in theory of the young girl, from working out to anti-wrinkle cream and liposuction. The young girl's determination is the same regardless, to disregard her body and make her body an abstraction. This abstraction is the result of the simulacra. Likewise, Elizabeth Sparkle represents the secondary stage of the simulacra of feminine representation because the social expectations of femininity is an example of the hyperreality as mentioned previously, rather than objective truth. The social pressure to perform femininity is inherently disconnected from objective reality and instead part of simulacra. By Elizabeth partaking in this social performance, she is partaking in the simulacra of feminine performance. Stage 3. The signs mark the absence of basic reality. The image calls into question what the reality is and if it even exists. When Elizabeth is able to transfer her consciousness into Sue, this marks the entry into the third stage of the simulacra. Elizabeth is able to transfer her consciousness, that of a 50-year-old woman, into the perfected state as seen through the lens of the hyperreality of feminine performance. Elizabeth can now exist as a 50-year-old woman in the body of a 20-something-year-old, and not just any 20-something-year-old, but a perfected and idealized 20-something-year-old. From the flesh of Elizabeth is birthed this entity, Sue. This is intended to be the perfected reflection of the simulacrum of feminine performance, though as Baudrillard defines, this phenomenon calls into question what the reality is and if it even exists. She is the smoothed-out ball of Play-Doh as shown in the advertisement for the substance, a perfected copy through the lens of the simulacra. Stage 4. The sign bears no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. Monstro Eliza Sue is reflective of the final stage of the simulacra. She is a complete detachment from reality, bearing no resemblance to women nor the beauty standards expressed or initially performed. She is the hyperbolic amalgamation of the performance art of femininity to the point of losing the attachment to the original goal and image of femininity. When Monstro Eliza Sue is born from the body of Sue, out is born a distorted amalgamation of the expectations of feminine performance. She is now all breasts and smiles, what every woman should be. When Monstro Eliza Sue is on stage, the sentiments from men throughout the film echo back to us. We hear the casting director, "Too bad she didn't have boobs in the middle of her face instead of that nose," as the imagery of just moments before is provoked when a breast erupts from Monstro Eliza Sue's face, causing the audience to erupt in horrified shrieks. We hear Harvey instructing Sue to smile as she is quite literally falling apart at the seams. He says, "Pretty girls should always smile," and cuts to Monstro Eliza Sue. Various teeth now freckle her body in a constant state of smiles. The male fantasies have quickly transformed into nightmare. Monstro Eliza Sue stands on stage alongside women representative of stage 2 of the simulacrum of feminine performance. They are beautiful, skin smooth and shaven, makeup peppering their faces. They initially retain their smiles despite their shock and confusion of the monster that stands beside them, their tits on display. Likewise, Monstro Eliza Sue exists in a constant state of smiling. Her breasts poke through her ripped dress like that of the topless dancers on stage beside her. Monstro Eliza Sue honors the sentiments of the feminine performance, though as Elizabeth Sparkle has moved through the stages of the simulacrum, these sentiments of the male gaze have become distorted, showcasing their absurdity through this hyperbolized final stage when she is all tits and smiles. As mentioned previously, once stage 4 of the simulacrum is achieved, we then enter what Baudrillard refers to as hyperreality. Baudrillard describes hyperreality as a condition in which the distinction between reality and simulation has collapsed, and where simulation or simulacra do not just represent reality, but effectively replace it or become more real. Monstro Eliza Sue is representative of hyperreality and this collapse. Through her pursuit of perfection within the simulacra of feminine performance, she has effectively lost the initial purpose of this pursuit. The line between reality and illusion has deteriorated. As the film progresses, we witness as Elizabeth Sparkle is driven mad by the attempt to upkeep the simulacrum of feminine performance, driving her deeper and deeper into the simulacra until she has become completely detached from reality. Elizabeth Sparkle throughout the film embodies many neurotic behaviors that are symptoms of existing within the simulacra. These behaviors are, however, not unique to Elizabeth Sparkle. Most women exist in the simulacra of feminine performance, and like the original analogy that highlights the map and the land, we as women have become unable to decipher what we do for ourselves and what we do to maintain our position within the simulacrum. Part 2. Chicken, eggs, and the desire to consume. The use of food is an important tool used within the substance to convey the dissonance from reality and hyperreality found within the simulacrum of feminine performance. Most women have experienced a dysphoric relationship with food due to the simulacrum. Due to the expectations of what we have come to associate with femininity, women are taught not only that on a physical level we should be slender and thin, but also that on a social level that there is shame in consumption. In her essay, There's Nothing Scarier Than a Hungry Woman, Laura Ma writes, "Eating alone was shameful because it couldn't be disguised as anything else. I didn't have company, so the attention couldn't be diverted from me. If I was eating alone, it was the result of two mortifying facts. Because I had nobody to eat with, and because I was hungry. I couldn't pretend I was eating for the social experience or because I was keeping somebody else company. I had to claim the desire as my own. It was my appetite, raw and exposed, and nothing else. And soon, appetite itself began to carry shame. If I ate alone, it was because I had to. It seemed to be admitting a need, confronting the fact that something was missing. It made me visible in a way that I hated. It highlighted my hunger not just for food, but for company. I remember the hot panic of eating something that I found difficult, something not able to be neatly or quickly eaten or broken up into small pieces, while other people watched me from all sides of the room. I became so used to other people watching me eat with a look of pity or judgment that I couldn't shake it loose for years. I found myself ricocheting constantly between two desires I had, the desire to eat and the desire to hide the fact that I did. Through the simulacrum of feminine performance, eating becomes disconnected from its reality, a necessary function we must engage in to sustain ourselves and maintain our health, and instead becomes a vessel for hyperreality, a social performance to be engaged in. How does eating a pizza make me look versus an apple? How am I being perceived by eating alone versus with others? What food should I eat that will allow me to look desirable whilst eating? We become aware and consumed by how eating makes us look, rather than its intended purpose of sustaining us. When I was a little girl, I was obsessed with the Olsen twins, and I would watch reruns of their sitcom So Little Time. I was probably around 5 years old when I was watching these reruns, and there's one scene I vividly remember from that show. One scene that stuck with me so much that I could recite the lines from memory to this day, whilst the rest of the show has been almost entirely lost to my memory. In the first episode of the show, Ashley Olsen's character Chloe enters the kitchen. Their caretaker Manuel packs their school lunches, and Chloe is horrified when she sees an apple in her lunch bag.
I can't eat an apple in school. No one looks good eating an apple. It's loud. You have to chomp it like a horse. Pieces get stuck between your teeth and juice runs down your chin.
Her sister Riley, played by Mary-Kate Olsen, enters the conversation.
Chloe has this new theory that in front of boys at school, you can only eat cute food.
Their caretaker, Manuel, is confused and questions what cute food is. To which Chloe responds,
Food you look cute eating. Like grapes, seedless of course. I mean, carrots, wrong. Celery, I want food that's seen and not heard.
I remember watching this episode and immediately reporting this information back to my best friend at school the next day. At just 5 years old, we began to discuss and internalize this idea of social performance. At this point, food now becomes not something to sustain our growing bodies, but a part of a performance of femininity. Food transformed in that moment from a device of nutrition to a device to signal desirability in the marketplace of femininity. As Chloe conveys in this scene, the food itself is not important. What is important is how she is perceiving whilst consuming it. How she is being consumed whilst consuming. We see this phenomenon depicted right away in The Substance, in one of its initial scenes. Tucked away in the bathroom stall, Elizabeth overhears the producer of her show, Harvey, on the phone. He speaks about firing Elizabeth as it is her 50th birthday and she is now deemed as too old for her role. Afterwards, we see Elizabeth and Harvey at the dinner table, and the camera lingers unflatteringly on Harvey as he gorges himself with shrimp. The film utilizes unflattering angles and over-the-top messy eating as a device to highlight the juxtaposition in the way women and men are allowed to eat in public, and as an extension, the way women and men are allowed to exist in public in general. Harvey does not care about the way he is perceived because he doesn't need to. We can see this contrasted by the fact that we don't see Elizabeth eating at all in this scene. We actually don't even know if she has a plate in front of her. She never takes a bite, and though the camera pans to Harvey's chaotic, messy plate, we never have a clear view of Elizabeth's side of the table. The only dishware we see on Elizabeth's side is a glass of wine with a drowning fly. Elizabeth maintains the social performance of femininity. She maintains the illusion of the simulacrum by not eating, and especially not eating in the manner Harvey does. Her role within the simulacrum is to be desirable, and therefore she cannot stuff her face with food as Harvey can, as it does not align with her social role. We see this social role, however, ruptured when the altering of Elizabeth's appearance makes it impossible to maintain the simulacrum of feminine performance, and in some ways she becomes freed from it. The first time we witness Elizabeth eating a full meal is after she returns her consciousness from Sue to Elizabeth for the first time. Because Elizabeth has Sue to upkeep this social performance, she no longer feels she should, needs to, or can upkeep the same level of social performance by comparison. As the film progresses and Elizabeth becomes increasingly removed from her ability to keep up with her social role in the simulacra of feminine performance, her appetite grows. As Elizabeth becomes increasingly disfigured, she continues to shield herself from the world. She doesn't leave her apartment and instead cooks and consumes chicken in mass quantities. She stands over pots of food, evoking the imagery of a solitary witch, unbothered by the perceptions of others. When Elizabeth herself can no longer be consumed is when she feels comfortable to consume freely. In the same scene, there is a sequence of cuts made between Elizabeth preparing chicken and of Sue's body on the show, drawing parallel again to female flesh and consumption, as something to be devoured. Laura Mulvey writes, "The image of woman as spectacle and fetish sets in motion another chain of metonymies, linking together various sites in which femininity is produced in advanced capitalist society, woman as consumed and woman as consumer of commodities, women exchanged in image, and women transforming themselves into image through commodity consumption." The use of food in horror, and in relation to female-led horror specifically, is a common and interesting device. This freedom of the shackling of the performance of femininity, and as a result the immediate instinct to be to unflatteringly stuff one's face with chicken, reminds me of a scene from Jennifer's Body, which likewise tackles the shedding of social expectations accompanied by being a woman. When teen seductress Jennifer Check is transformed into a demonic succubus through sacrifice gone wrong, in her half-conscious state she finds herself at her best friend Needy's house. We witness as Jennifer opens the fridge and she begins to toss unwanted items behind her until finally she finds the food item that will seemingly satiate her hunger: roast chicken. Jennifer throws the chicken on the ground and begins to tear into it with her bare hands before consuming the chicken in a manner more reminiscent of a feral animal than that of a teenage girl. Needy tries to stop her from eating the chicken, though is met with a primal demonic screech from Jennifer. Jennifer, like Elizabeth, has recently been freed from the social expectation to perform femininity in the socially anticipated way. Jennifer is no longer Jennifer. Rather, she has been possessed by a demon succubus that has no concept or care for the social norms of humans, and the first thing she does is stuff her face, to consume as she has previously been consumed. We see this device also used in Rosemary's Baby. As the demonic fetus grows inside of Rosemary's womb, her need to upkeep her social role within the simulacra of feminine performance is overridden by the primal desire to consume. But like Jennifer, she only allowed herself to consume in this way because of the demonic presence within her. In her essay, There's Nothing Scarier Than a Hungry Woman, Laura Ma writes, "From the side of the counter, Rosemary picks up a piece of chicken heart with her fingers, raises it to her mouth, and begins to chew. It is uncomfortable, nauseous viewing, not least because Farrow was a strict vegetarian at the time of filming. Rosemary is tentative and methodical, nothing driving her but desire, simple and unapologetic. Appetite and nothing else. She catches sight of herself in the reflective side of the toaster, and suddenly confronted with the image of what she is doing, she retches into the sink. The shame of being caught desiring, even by herself, being caught wanting, being caught with an appetite." Similarly, Elizabeth consumes as if making up for the lifetime of restricted social performance. Though this is not without consequence, as her consciousness shifts back into Sue, Sue grows disgusted by this behavior. After one night of Elizabeth's binge eating, the scene cuts to Sue going to work the next day. As she performs her routine for the camera, a bulge sticks out suddenly from her hips. She panics, and the director says he saw something bizarre on the monitor, and they all stand around as they watch close-up shots of her body. She is mortified and rushes to the bathroom to examine her body. She locates the strange bulge again on her hips and presses onto her skin, moving the strange, mysterious bulge to her belly button, where she digs into her abdomen, pulling out a chicken wing from her stomach. Horrified, she awakens on the bathroom floor as Sue. It was a nightmare. Though as she enters the living room, she finds the discarded remnants of Elizabeth's binging. As she shifts back into Sue, she shifts back into the social expectation of the simulacrum of feminine performance. By contrast, we never witness Sue eat anything. The only thing we witness her consume is a Diet Coke from the fridge. She seductively lifts the Coke to her lips, evoking the imagery of Kate Moss in a Diet Coke commercial. A beverage that can be consumed seductively that advertises to others that you are consuming something with 0 calories, signaling to others that you are essentially consuming as close as you can to nothing at all. This battle between Sue and Elizabeth's appetite feels incredibly relatable to the experience that many women have with restrictive and binge eating patterns. I have been both Sue and Elizabeth, especially when I was younger and struggling with an eating disorder. I would engage in the same pattern. I'd feel confident like Sue, consuming only a Diet Coke, though soon this confidence would wear off and I'd be consumed by hunger that eventually couldn't be ignored, before gorging myself with as much food as I could. Subsequently, I'd wake up as Sue again, bloated, feeling the echoing effects of my ravenous self just the day before, in the same way Sue was haunted by the chicken wing Elizabeth consumed. The cycle would repeat. The simulacrum of feminine performance tells us that there is shame in consumption and shame in being perceived consuming, especially as we must maintain the perfect body, a body that echoes the physique of youth. Laurie Penny states in her book, Meat Market, Female Flesh Under Capitalism, late capitalism quite literally brands the bodies of women. It sears its seal into our flesh, cauterizing growth and sterilizing descent. Femininity itself has become a brand, a narrow and shrinking formula of commoditized identity which can be sold back to women. She writes, "From the moment we become old enough to want ourselves, the corporate cast of womanhood is stamped into our subconscious, burnt into our brains, reminding us that we must strive for conformity, that we can never be free." This branding takes place in a very physical way. The branding of the simulacra of feminine performance exists commonly in the dysregulated hormones and ravaged state of our metabolisms from crash diets and restrictive eating. Food becomes merely a stage prop in the performance of femininity. The simulacrum of feminine performance requires one to always be consumable, whilst consuming as little as possible. Theory of the Young Girl states, "The young girl never gives herself. She only gives what she has, which is to say, the array of qualities that they have loaned to her. This is also why it is not possible to love the young girl, but only to consume her." Part 3. The Pursuit of Youth and Mother-Daughter Rivalry. Though the substance is not explicitly about a mother-daughter relationship, the dynamic that takes place between Sue and Elizabeth quickly begins to mirror that of a toxic mother-daughter relationship despite being of the same consciousness. Though not in a traditional sense, Sue is still born from the body of Elizabeth. Elizabeth's body, through being penetrated and injected with the substance, creates Sue from her own flesh and blood. They are one, as is repeatedly stated throughout the film. This is not dissimilar to the way in which the fertilization of an egg in a mother's body creates the flesh of a baby from her own body within the womb. The substance itself alludes to this in the opening scene of the film. The substance opens with a shot of an egg, a symbol of fertility, birth, and reproduction. We watch as the egg is injected with an unfamiliar substance, fertilizing the egg and begins to duplicate. Thus begins the cycle of perfected reproduction. Within the simulacrum of feminine performance that we exist in, there comes to be an association with the value of a woman with her youth, as I have spoken about in previous essays many times. We come to perceive a woman to be in her prime in her 20s or even her teens, suggesting that a woman's value decreases after this. This notion is echoed by Harvey, who, after making multiple degrading comments about Elizabeth being old, adds that a woman's fertility begins to decline after the age of 25, suggesting that a woman's value inherently corresponds to her fertility. Though even these notions of women's fertility dropping after her 20s is often grossly exaggerated. This is once again an example of the map metaphor that Baudrillard used to explain the idea of simulacra. What is the objective truth of the land, and what is the illusion of the map that has been placed on top of the land? It is often suggested that the attraction of older men to young women is merely biological, as women's fertility declines after her 20s, though what is more likely happening is a manipulation and cherry-picking of data and old defunct studies in order to support one's own cultural truth. Despite being older than Elizabeth, Harvey degrades her multiple times for her age throughout the film, yet finds camaraderie and respect amongst men her same age or older. Susan Sontag writes in The Double Standard of Aging, "The prestige of youth afflicts everyone in this society to some degree. Men, too, are prone to periodic bouts of depression about aging, for instance, when feeling insecure or unfulfilled or insufficiently rewarded in their jobs. But men rarely panic about aging in the way women often do. Getting older is less profoundly wounding for a man, for in addition to the propaganda for youth that puts both men and women on the defense as they age, there is a double standard about aging that denounces women with special severity. Society is much more permissive about aging in men, as it is more tolerant of the sexual infidelities of husbands. Men are allowed to age without penalty in several ways that women are not. This society offers fewer rewards for aging women than it does for men. Being physically attractive counts much more in a woman's life than it does in a man's, but beauty identified as it is for women with youthfulness does not stand up well to age. Exceptional mental powers can increase with age, but women are rarely encouraged to develop their minds above dilettante standards." The culture of the simulacrum that places youth as an inherent value in women results in the breeding of an animosity between older and younger women, especially in mother-daughter dynamics. The mother gives birth to their daughter, and in the process, their bodies are most often permanently altered in this process. Elizabeth, through giving life to Sue, has now been left with a permanent and large scar that runs down the center of her spine, not dissimilar to a C-section scar left across a woman's lower abdomen. Elizabeth's body is permanently altered so that Sue can exist in her pristine state. We witnessed the breeding of culturally inflamed rivalry between mothers and daughters instilled as early as conception. One of the most common old wives' tales used when determining the sex of a fetus before they are born is the suggestion that whilst a baby boy will make the mother more beautiful, a baby girl makes her pregnant mother uglier, to steal her mother's beauty and give it to herself, though this notion persists long after pregnancy as well, and is reflective in Sue and Elizabeth's relationship. As the story progresses, the relationship between Sue and Elizabeth begins to specifically mirror the dynamic of that of a teenage daughter and a mother specifically. As daughters enter puberty, oftentimes mother will see the image of their younger selves reflected back to them in their daughters. As their daughters enter the sexual marketplace in their so-called prime, as is suggested within the simulacra of feminine performance, the mother is reminded that she is no longer in hers. Thus, a rift is created within the mother-daughter relationship, and within that rift hosts the breeding of a parasitic and toxic animosity. Through their daughter, the mothers see a mirror into the versions of themselves they feel as though they have sacrificed in order to have a child, to bring their daughters to life. I can't even count the number of women I met in my preteen and teen years, the mothers of my friends, who would say to me and my friends as teenagers, "I used to have a body like yours until I had children." Or in an awkward, threatening declaration state, "Enjoy your body now, because once you have children, it's all over." We see these same threats and declarations made by Elizabeth about Sue. Despite them sharing the same consciousness, there begins to breed a rivalry as their perceived value within the sexual marketplace diverges. Sue and Elizabeth, although the same person, begin to see each other as rivals in the same way toxic relationships between teenage daughters and mothers do. Sue's time restraint of having only 7 days to live her life until she has to turn off for a week mirrors the way in which teenagers are often given time restraints on their personal freedoms. As they exercise their newfound bodily autonomy, for example, they still often must act under the constraints of a curfew. As the film goes on, Sue grows increasingly frustrated with her own curfew of sorts, and at one point, as most teenagers do, she finally rebels. She removes extraspinal fluid from Elizabeth's body, which acts as a booster, allowing their shared consciousness to stay in the body of Sue for extra time than what was originally allotted. As a result, when their shared consciousness switchbacks to Elizabeth, Elizabeth awakens to discover her index finger has been altered and resembles that of an extremely elderly woman. Later on, Sue extracts days' worth of spinal fluid so their shared consciousness can exist in her body for an extra week. Due to not respecting the balance, when Elizabeth awakens, her entire body is altered. She has been rapidly aged by this process and now resembles that of an elderly woman. Like the old wives' tale about the baby girl in the womb, Sue begins to steal Elizabeth's beauty. Due to this, Elizabeth begins to resent Sue. Despite them being the same person, Elizabeth refuses to leave the house in her altered state and begins to hermit herself in her apartment. In one scene, Elizabeth watches Sue on TV giving an interview. Elizabeth shouts at the TV, proclaiming how Sue would be nothing without her, and references the altered state of her body and then the sacrifice she made in order to get Sue to where she is today. This again mirrors the way in which animosity can be bred in mother-daughter dynamics. This is done intentionally as the simulacrum of feminine performance is designed to exploit and eroticize young women and girls whilst disempowering older women. The simulacrum of feminine performance progressively devalues the role of mothers in exchange for the fetishization of young female flesh by suggesting that a woman's prime is inherent to her place within the sexual marketplace rather than her role within community as a mother or leader, for example. Susan Sontag writes, "The desire to be the right age has a special urgency for women it never has for a man. A much greater part of her self-esteem and pleasure in life is threatened when she ceases to be young. Most men experience getting older with regret, apprehension, but most women experience it even more painfully, with shame. Aging is a man's destiny, something that must happen because he is a human being. For a woman, aging is not only her destiny, because she is that more narrowly defined kind of human being, a woman. It is also her vulnerability." This film in many ways acts as a modern parallel of the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which likewise is a story about the rivalry between a mother and a daughter prompted by the simulacrum of feminine performance and the emphasis of youth and beauty within it. In the original telling of Snow White from 1812, the pregnant queen wishes for a beautiful daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair black as ebony. She is granted her wish, and at first she is grateful for her beautiful daughter. That is, until her daughter's beauty begins to surpass her own. Elizabeth is the beautiful yet aging queen, and Sue the beautiful daughter she wished for, though that is destined to replace her. On Elizabeth's 50th birthday, she walks down the hallway of photographs of herself, in a way a hallway of mirrors affirming her worth. She has throughout her life been affirmed of her beauty and therefore her worth by those around her in the same way the queen is affirmed of her beauty by the mirror in Snow White. Due to the women's bathroom being out of order, Elizabeth uses the men's bathroom in the studio they film her TV show in. Harvey, the producer of her show, enters to use the urinal, not knowing Elizabeth is in the stall. He is on the phone and begins to discuss how Elizabeth is aging out of her market value, referring to her as old. They discuss replacing her with someone younger, someone more beautiful. Elizabeth exits the stall, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and like the queen in Snow White, she stares at her reflection, and for the first time when asking who is the fairest of them all, she is met with an answer other than herself. She has reached the end of her market value as a woman within the simulacra of feminine performance. And with her fair skin and raven hair, her beauty emphasized by her girlish charm and sweetness, Sue acts as a Snow White. And though they share the same consciousness, the same motions of disdain and jealousy can be found in the substance. Elizabeth grows jealous of Sue when she is unable to embody her. Both Elizabeth and the evil queen's vanities grow so strong that they both end up transforming themselves into old women, further alienating themselves from their goals of beauty in their attempt to attain it. Both try to destroy their younger rivals, and both are killed as a result of their vanity, driven to madness by the fleeting and unattainable nature of the simulacrum of feminine performance. Part 4. The Simulacrum in the Mirror. Within the simulacra, perception is skewed. One cannot decipher objective truth from the deceptive illusion intrinsic to the simulacrum. Even when one looks in the mirror, simulacra is inescapable. If anything, when one looks in the mirror, simulacra is most potent. We look in the mirror and the simulacrum stares back at us. One of the most heartbreaking threads woven throughout the film is the way in which Elizabeth progressively sees herself through the lens of the simulacrum. She begins to believe that her worth is intrinsically tied to her capacity to perform the simulacrum of feminine performance, as many of us do. In Theory of the Young Girl, it is written, "Beauty is the mode of unveiling proper to the young girl in the spectacle. This is why she is also a generic product, containing all of the abstraction of that which is forced to address itself to a certain segment of the sexual marketplace, inside of which everything looks alike. Capitalism has created wealth because it discovered where it had formerly been invisible. This is how, for example, capitalism created beauty, health, or youth as wealth. That is, as qualities that possess you. The young girl is never satisfied with her submission to consumer metaphysics, with the docility of her entire being and obvious of her entire body to the norms of the spectacle. This is why she displays the need to exhibit it. They have offended the thing I hold most dear, my image. The young girl already lives as a couple. That is, she lives with her image. Elizabeth Sparkle's existential crisis, of course, begins, as mentioned, when she is in the bathroom and overhears Harvey speaking about how Elizabeth is now 50 and therefore must be fired as she is now old, despite being younger than Harvey herself. Elizabeth exits the stall and stares at herself in the mirror. She contemplates her place within culture, her place that had been up until this point affirmed. Theory of the young girl states, the young girl is never worried about herself, but only about her value. Thus, when she encounters hatred, she is struck by doubt. Has her market value dropped? If it were worth it to them to speak, young girls would say, our use value may interest men, but it does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities proves it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. Karl Marx, Capital. If she cannot keep up with the performance, what will happen to her? When Elizabeth first transitions into Sue, she leaves her body discarded on the bathroom floor. She shows no remorse or care for the shell of her previous self. Instead, she is preoccupied by the excitement for her new, perfected body. The same way the studio will likewise show the same excitement for Sue and disregard for Elizabeth. When Sue transforms back into Elizabeth for the first time, she sits at her kitchen table and marks her calendar on what days she will be Sue and on what days she will be Elizabeth so she can schedule her days accordingly. Though while she writes Sue on the calendar, instead of writing Elizabeth, she writes an X, referencing that the days as Elizabeth aren't really days to be lived at all, but rather days to not live, to rot, a purgatory of sorts. This also echoes the sentiment Harvey expressed in a previous scene when he first meets Sue. When Sue is brought to Harvey's office after getting the job, he says he will set her up with his assistant and then forgets her name. Isabella, the assistant, corrects him. He then questions, who has time to say that? And says he will call her Cindy instead. It's shorter. It's better. A woman's job is to be convenient. By Elizabeth not writing her name and instead writing an X, she echoes this sentiment that Harvey expresses onto herself. She is too much. Too inconvenient. She is 3 syllables, whilst Sue is 1. Sue is convenient. Sue is easier to love. This likewise echoes the way in which women are shunned for growing out of the convenient naivety and people-pleasing attributes of youth as they grow from girls into women. As Susan Sontag expresses, men are celebrated for qualities one associates with getting older. She writes, masculinity is identified with competence, autonomy, self-control, qualities which the disappearance of youth does not threaten. Competence in most of the activities expected from men, physical sports excepted, increases with age. Femininity is identified with incompetence, helplessness, passivity, non-competitiveness, being nice. Age does not improve these qualities. Women and girls are celebrated when they are young because they are malleable, often easier to take advantage of, and, like saying the name Sue, more convenient. When Sue is introduced to us as the viewer, there is a persistent use of montage footage sequences that focus on the body of Sue. At times they seem repetitive and forceful, though they satirize the tendency for film to linger unnecessarily on the flesh of young women. Laura Mulvey writes in Visual and Other Pleasures, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connotate to be looked at-ness. Mainstream film neatly combines spectacle and narrative. The presence of women is an indispensable element of spectacle in normal narrative film, yet her visual presence tends to work against the development of a storyline, to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. After her first week as Sue, she makes the switch back into Elizabeth. Elizabeth returns to the studio where she witnesses her photos being removed from the hallway, her image being so easily scrubbed from the place she was once so adored and praised. Elizabeth is clearly hurt by this, though she would go on to do the same just days later when she transforms back into Sue. Sue removes the photos of Elizabeth from the apartment and places them into storage in the same way the studio did. Likewise, Sue builds a storage room to hide the bodies away when she's not using the other. Amongst all the gore, body horror, and close-up shots of Dennis Quaid eating, the scene that left me feeling the most uncomfortable was the scene when Elizabeth is getting ready for her date. It was uncomfortable because it was real. Because the film was holding a mirror up to me and showing me how heartbreaking it is the way I treat myself at times. Watching this scene for the second time in the theater, I got teary-eyed as I watched Elizabeth obsess over her appearance in the mirror. She applies and reapplies her makeup. She primps and preems herself for hours until eventually all she can do is collapse on the floor in defeat. She can't stop comparing herself to Sue, the version of herself she was just days before. From the outside perspective, Elizabeth looks silly, even crazy in the scene, and yet I have been her so many times. I so desperately wanted to jump through the screen and hug Elizabeth at this moment, as I am reminded of all the times I canceled plans because I felt ugly. Whether it was because I felt bloated or am breaking out in pimples, I have had this same breakdown. And I am reminded of just last week as I was getting ready for a date. I became so consumed and frustrated by the way in which no clothing seemed to fit right on my body that I, like Elizabeth, collapsed on my floor in tears. The other day, I texted one of my friends complimenting her. A few hours later, she responds to my text with, "Thank you. I'm having an ugliest girl in the world attack today." A feeling most women are all too familiar with. A pang hit my heart as I read her text. The same pang that hit me as I watched Elizabeth crumble in her bedroom under the weight of feminine performance. Eventually, when Sue is told that she will be hosting the network's New Year's special, her stardom skyrockets and she begins to take extra spinal fluid from Elizabeth, allowing her to stay in Sue's body for longer than the allotted 7 days. She disrespects the cycle because she sees Elizabeth as a burden and a barrier as everyone else around her seemingly does. This, however, further deforms Elizabeth. When the switch is finally made and the consciousness transferred back over to Elizabeth's body, she is horrified when she awakens to see herself greatly transformed. By stealing days of extra spinal fluid, she has aged her body by decades. We witness as Elizabeth progressively shields herself from the outside world, deeming herself unworthy of being perceived if she cannot upkeep the simulacrum of feminine performance. The double standard about aging converts the life of women into an inexplorable march towards a condition in which they are not just unattractive, but disgusting. The profoundest terror of a woman's life is the moment represented in the statue by Rodin called Old Age, the old courtesan. A naked old woman seated, pathetically, contemplates her flat, pendulous, ruined body. On one night, the TV plays as Elizabeth cooks mass quantities of chicken in her apartment. Sue is on an interview on the TV and begins to make passive-aggressive comments about Elizabeth, alluding to her being old and outdated. She taunts Elizabeth as others have taunted her. Elizabeth begins to throw eggs at the screen. She then throws eggs at the window that has Sue's billboard in front of it. She then begins to place newspaper pages over the window to shield her from Sue's ever-present gaze. This pervasive gaze of Sue through the billboard and the TV are representative of the persistent surveillance of the self. The neurosis caused by the simulacrum of feminine performance results in the persistent awareness of being perceived, of watching yourself from a bird's eye view. As John Berger states in a quote I have cited too many times, and I told myself I wouldn't cite anymore, but I have to, because it's so relevant to this film. From The Ways of Seeing, a woman must continually watch herself. She is almost always accompanied by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room or while she is weeping at the death of her father, she can scarcely avoid envisioning herself walking or weeping. From earliest childhood, she has been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually, and so she comes to consider the survey and the surveyed within her as the two consistent yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. Elizabeth cannot escape this internalized view of herself that she has developed, which is manifest in Sue's omnipresent watchful eyes, and due to this, she spirals into madness. When the switch is made back into Sue, she stands infuriated in the apartment, staring at the discarded chicken flesh and other dirtied food plates around the room, the TV and windows covered in newspaper. Sue gathers jars and says she can't return back to Elizabeth's body. She begins to hurl insults as Elizabeth. Gross, old, fat, disgusting, she yells as she begins to extract jars worth of spinal fluid from Elizabeth, enough to sustain herself for months as Sue. Sue locks Elizabeth in a dark room, shielding her from the outside world. Months go by, and Sue stares outside the window at her new billboard advertising her New Year's special. Before going to sleep, she enters the storage room where Elizabeth's body has been left to rot. When Sue extracts the spinal fluid from Elizabeth, she is shocked to see that the usually clear liquid is instead a dark blackish brown. In a panic, Sue calls the substance hotline. "There is no more stabilizer fluid," she says. "It means you've reached the end. You've drained it all out. If you want more, you must let the fluid regenerate." The man on the phone says simply and unsympathetically. Sue's nose begins to bleed and she begins to feel faint. The man on the phone instructs her that she must make the switch back into Elizabeth's body. Sue is resistant, though eventually realizes she has no choice as she begins to lose consciousness. She crawls into the bathroom where she is forced to make the switch into Elizabeth. Elizabeth looks in the mirror and she is unrecognizable. As she leaves the bathroom, there is a crack and she falls to the ground. Her body is deformed and frail. She calls the substance hotline and tells them she wants to stop. The man on the phone asks if she is certain, reminding her that once you stop, you can't go back. Elizabeth confirms that she is certain. The man informs her that they will deliver the termination fluid. And for the first time, we see Elizabeth develop sympathy towards herself. Elizabeth drags her old photos out of the storage room. She stares at the version of herself that she was before starting the process, longing for the version of herself that no longer exists. Though this is hardly progress. She longs for the version of herself that is just out of reach, as she always has. When Elizabeth retrieves the termination kit and injects Sue's body with the termination fluid, she stops halfway. She cannot bring herself to destroy the version of herself that people love, the version of herself that she loves as a result of being loved. As she removes the half-used syringe, she begins to plead with Sue's lifeless body. "I can't do this. I need you because I hate myself," she admits. "Come on, you gotta get ready. It's our big night. Come on, they're gonna love you so much," she says as she attempts to wake Sue into consciousness. She continues, "You're the only lovable part of me. You have to come back. You have to come back." This sentiment is reminiscent of the passage from Theory of a Young Girl. However vast her narcissism, the young girl does not love herself. What she loves is her image. That is something that is not only foreign and exterior to her, but that possesses her in the full sense of the word. The young girl lives under the tyranny of this ungrateful master. Elizabeth attempts to switch, but it doesn't work. So she stabs Sue in the heart with the switch needle, and instead of switching, Sue is brought to life. They exist sentient at the same time. The pair are equally shocked. Their movements parallel one another in a mirrored horror. Sue glances down at the termination fluid, which sends her into a spiraled rage. Sue attacks Elizabeth, slamming her face into the mirror repeatedly until she is mauled, a potent symbolism for the destructive nature of vanity leading to her demise. Sue continues to beat Elizabeth in her trance of murderous rage. Though the second Elizabeth dies, Sue snaps out of her trance-like rage and is horrified by what she has done. Though she looks up at her billboard, the show must go on. As Sue readies for the New Year's show, she looks beautiful. She sits in her vanity chair and begins to cough. She knows something is wrong and hurries to the bathroom, where she continues to cough until a tooth falls out. She looks in the mirror and begins to pull at her loosened teeth. Her mouth is now gummy and dripping in blood. She panics as her body begins to disintegrate in front of her. As she waits in the elevator, her fingernail rips off and then her ear. She hurries home, desperate to embody a perfected version of herself. She injects herself with the activator fluid. "Please give me a better version of myself," she pleads as she inserts the fluid into her veins. She screams before falling to the ground and crying out in pain. Another version of herself is born. Tolentino writes in her essay, Always Be Optimizing, "These days, it is perhaps more psychologically seamless than ever for an ordinary woman to spend her life walking towards the idealized mirage of her own self-image. She can believe reasonably enough that with the full encouragement of feminism, that she herself is the architect of the exquisite, constant, and often pleasurable type of power that this image holds over her time, her money, her decisions, her selfhood, and her soul. Monstro Eliza Sue is born. As she looks in the mirror, a deformed monster looks back to her. The previous forms of herself lay discarded on the floor. Sue in the bathroom and Elizabeth in the living room. She stares at them longingly, shells of herself now lost to her vanity. This stage is reflective of the way in which the pursuit of feminine perfection can often lead to us distancing ourselves further from this ideal. When I was a teenager and I began to starve myself to be thinner, this resulted in my hormones growing horribly dysregulated, which triggered episodes of persistent and consuming cystic acne that covered my entire face. To fix this, I then went on Accutane, a toxic drug that can lead to adverse and permanent side effects, though the risk was worth it to me to just feel pretty. I am reminded of the way in which Ozempic, filler, and Botox have become so normalized, despite us not fully knowing the long-term consequences of these procedures. I am reminded of supermodel Linda Evangelista undergoing the cosmetic fat removal procedure Cool Sculpting, though due to complications, Evangelista was left, in her words, permanently deformed and horribly disfigured. I'm reminded of when Demi Moore herself was under scrutiny in the public eye just a few years ago for what was speculated to be a botched plastic surgery, though was praised later when she was photographed looking better than ever after seemingly fixing the surgery gone wrong. Elizabeth Sparkle is no different than us, and this final stage is representative of the fact that feminine performance within the simulacra is not conducive to sustaining human life, but rather an image of femininity, which will inevitably lead to our demise as we ignore our humanity in pursuit of superficial feminine performance. Though in spite of her monstrous state, Monstro Eliza Sue still attempts to upkeep the simulacrum of feminine performance. She puts her gown back on, tearing it to fit her misshapen body. She stares at herself in the mirror and shoves an earring into her head where her ears might have been, unable to locate an earlobe. She attempts to curl a single strand of hair and it burns off in the curler. I noticed that this scene was the source of much laughter each time I watched this film in the theaters, especially by men, and I couldn't help but feel a deep intrinsic sadness as I watched this sequence of Monstro Eliza Sue attempt to upkeep this social performance. Her rage and violent desperation for beauty and perfection has been transformed into a solemn last attempt to feel pretty. I found myself teary-eyed watching this scene because I've been her. I felt this way when I had cystic acne covering my entire face as a teenager. My desperate attempts at covering my red and bumpy skin with foundation felt futile as I was left with an obvious textured mess. I've looked at myself in the mirror and seen a monster staring back at me. My attempts at beauty and social performance of femininity felt pathetic. Monstro Eliza Sue removes the photo of Elizabeth from the frame and makes a mask of the photo. The same photo she once hid from herself, she now wears as a mask to conceal what she has become. Once again, this is something many women can relate to. We spend so much of our lives insecure with ourselves, grasping at perfection that will never be attained. We cry because we feel fat or bloated or ugly, and then one day we grow old and look back at photos of our younger selves and see not only the beauty in those girls we once were, but the humanity in them. We have panic attacks on our 25th birthdays, and it isn't until our 40th that we realize we were babies back then. Though it may not be until our 70th that we realize 40 is so young as well. And it isn't until we are on our deathbeds when we realize how much time we wasted grasping at past versions of ourselves or fretting over aging when we were so young. Though Elizabeth is never able to fully abandon her vanity, she wears the mask of her previous face because it is the face that is currently unattainable. When she transformed back into Sue after murdering the body of Elizabeth, she abandoned again the love she had for Elizabeth. And it was only again when she no longer had access to Sue that she claws for the next best version of herself. She pleads for the audience to see her for what she is, but they can't. She has become lost to the simulacrum of feminine performance, a copy without an original. All they see is a monster. Monstro Eliza Sue runs out of the building and into the street before her body falls apart entirely. As is written in the theory of the young girl becomes demonetized when she goes out of circulation. When she loses the possibility of re-entering the marketplace, she begins to rot. Leaving Elizabeth's face on a small deformed pile of flesh, she crawls to her star on the Walk of Fame, where the flesh disintegrates into a pile of red liquid that is cleaned the next day. All that is left is her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, her superficial reward for her upkeep within the simulacra of feminine performance that in the end meant nothing. As Elizabeth dies, smiling up at the sky and fading into oblivion, I am reminded of this quote by Andrea Dworkin in Right Wing Women. Only women die one by one, smiling up to the last minute. Smile of the siren, smile of the coy girl, smile of the mad woman. Only women die one by one, polished to perfection or unkept behind locked doors, too desperately ashamed to cry out. Only women die one by one, still believing that if only they had been perfect wife, mother, or whore, they would not have come to hate life so much, to find it so strangely difficult and empty, themselves so hopelessly confused and despairing. Women die mourning not the loss of their own lives, but their own inexcusable inability to achieve perfection as men define it for them. Women desperately try to embody a male-defined feminine ideal because survival depends on it. The ideal, by definition, turns a woman into a function, deprives her of any individuality that is self-serving or self-created, not useful to the male in his scheme of things. The monstrous female quest for male-defined perfection is so intrinsically hostile to freedom and integrity, leads inevitably to bitterness, paralysis, or death. But like the mirage in the desert, the life-giving oasis that is not there, survival is promised in this conformity and nowhere else. The Substance is still available to watch now in theaters, so if you missed a screening near you or are eager to rewatch it again in the comfort of your home, I am so excited to tell you that The Substance will be coming to MUBI on October 31st. So be sure to click the link in my description or go to mubi.com/finalgirlstudios to get a whole month of great cinema for free on MUBI. The Substance has been one of the most talked about and buzzworthy films of the year, and you don't want to miss it. MUBI is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there is always something new to discover. Thanks to MUBI, I recently discovered another movie that has become one of my favorite watches of the year, titled House of Tolerance, which is streaming now on MUBI in the US. As always, I am so grateful to partner with MUBI, as MUBI is a service I have genuinely used and loved for years that has allowed me to easily access and discover films that have since become my favorites. You can try MUBI for free for 30 days at mubi.com/finalgirlstudios for a whole month of great cinema for free.